Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for being here. I am very pleased to introduce a colleague and a longtime collaborator, Romy Hecht, who is visiting us from Santiago, Chile, because she's also going to the conference in Providence. So we are very grateful to the to the Society of Architectural Historians for pulling her from a wonderful summer in Chile to these northern cold latitudes. Romy is professor of the history of landscape, history and theory of landscape at the Universidad Católica in Santiago. And she received her Ph.D. in the history and theory of architecture from Princeton University. But what she did there was to study landscape in spite of the title of the degree. And her dissertation, which was advised by our own Ed Eigen, was titled The Attack on Greenery, Critical Perceptions of the American Man-Made Landscape, 1955-1969. And this research explored the deep and transformational changes in the decade and a half during the mid-20th century when the work of McHarg, Jackson, and Rachel Carson simultaneously, but of course in very different ways, argued for a different vision of the relationship between American culture and its environment. For me, what was particularly important about this work is its historical and critical look at the trajectories of these thought leaders in our field, because it situated their work in their larger context, which is something that we rarely discuss. In other words, we know very well the text by Jackson, by McHarg, and by Carson, but we much less discuss what was going on politically in this country at that time, and how were they positioning their work. And so Romy's dissertation makes a very important contribution to this scholarship. And while this isn't published officially, you can access this dissertation, and I highly recommend it. Upon her return to Chile, and if you asked Romy, how long were you here, she tells you something like 6 years, 7 months, 3 days, 2 hours, whatever. So she was happy to go back. She joined the faculty at the Universidad Católica and turns her attention to scholarships on the landscapes of her beloved country, about which much work needed to be done, as is the case with a lot of Latin American landscapes and their scholarship. Today, we will hear about her current research project, The Green Ideal, Botanical Practices, and the Creation of Santiago's Civic Landscape, which traces the transformation of post-colonial Santiago from a native semi-arid condition to a green, lush urban landscape that would give this then young nation and its capital city a new identity. Equally important, in addition to being a scholar and a professor, Romy has been engaged in doing important foundational work on landscape advocacy and activism to nurture, disseminate, and ultimately ingrain a culture of landscape in Chile. And this effort takes several forms. First, she has translated some key texts from the English to the Spanish, such as J.B. Jackson's The Necessity for Ruins and other essays, published by Ediciones Arc, and has completed the translation of several of Olmsted's key essays, such as The Public Parks and the Enlargement of Towns on the Use of the Axe and Yosemite, to name a few, and others which will be gathered in an anthology that will be published in the future. She has published widely on questions of public space, public realm, and the history of civic landscapes in Santiago, not only in academic journals, but also in the public press, working to implant questions of history and environment conservation in the public imagination. And then finally, in 2015, she co-founded the Lovescapes, which is a weekly digital journal whose objective is to build a platform for critical discussion about the transformations of the Chilean landscape. This was followed in 2016 by the creation of a non-for-profit organization called the Corporación Cultura de Paisaje, the Corporation for Cultural Landscapes, which is dedicated to the development of research projects, publications, and exhibitions focused on the valorization and the conservation of the landscape in Chile. I highly recommend that you visit these websites. They have great historical and visual documentation on a wide variety of topics, from landscapes of extraction to vernacular agricultural landscapes to hydrological landscapes, valley and mountain landscapes, etc. This work has received international attention and recognition. I should also mention anecdotally, I remember when you wrote to me to say you were embarking on this, that one of the first things you did was to buy a drone, and I thought, oh, J.B. Jackson is still with us, looking at the vernacular landscape from the air. How very perfect as she began this important line of work in Chile. So welcome, Romy. It's wonderful to have you back, and please join me.
Okay, thanks, Anita, for that introduction. Thanks, of course, for having me here. I'm delighted to see again so many familiar faces. And I'm equally happy, I think, to have the chance to present part of the work I've been developing for the last 6 years, I would say. First, as an intensive and extensive research that has been developed in national and international archives, libraries, some private collections too, and lately under the format of a book that, as you can imagine, and I'm afraid, it seems to be a never-ending project. So what I would love to do here today is basically to begin by exposing the main motivation behind this work in order to focus next on one of the aspects to expand and illustrate the task undertaken. Let's begin by saying that my inquiry is extremely simple. I just want to examine the nature of Santiago's landscape, exposing how it came to be, and chronicling the actors responsible for its development. But to make things a little more complex, let's say too that my research has a twofold purpose. The first is to unravel the existence of an arboreal culture in Chile's capital city, one defined by the crossing of political, economic, and social threads that in the period spanning from the 1830s through the 1930s changed the city's colonial phase and structure by implementing an artificial ensemble of plantations where there had been none. And believe me, this is not a minor issue if we remember that Santiago was founded in 1541 in a cool semi-arid Mediterranean setting, characterized by a dry atmosphere due to a mild winter and an extended hot summer season. So the fact that the area that you see in this slide did not offer a natural scenario for plant and tree varieties, what to me at least makes this project even more interesting. Because I'm sure that today only a few Santiaguinos and Chileans, for that matter, know that from the 19th century on, exotic trees and geometries of planting were envisioned as symbols of political emancipation, as malleable agents of urban reform and modernization, and as pieces de résistance against Santiago's scarce botanical biodiversity. But also, to be honest, how can you blame those who, on a daily basis, open their windows to see this view so many times that in the end they consider it normal? So the point here is that to make this image normal implied the transformation of Santiago's natural variables, meaning its endemic vegetation, characterized by isolated patches of thorn bushes, and on some favorable south-facing slopes by medium-sized trees, and I'm talking here 60 to 80 feet, with hard leaves suited to long droughts as well as to cooler morning and night temperatures. So, what I'm stating here is that Santiago's arboreal culture was indeed shaped after Chile's independence and was largely based upon 4 tree planting operations that for nearly a century concatenated visions of civic and cosmopolitan futures with landscape productions, thereby transforming specific sites and the city itself through the inclusion of alamedas, or poplar line avenues, originally established as part of a water management program to tame the Mapocho River, the city's main water course. The second operation was the creation of the Quinta Normal de Agricultura, Chile's first and only acclimatization garden, envisioned as a site to promote the citywide acceptance of exotic species and foreign vegetal patterns. Then you have the shaping of an extended linear public garden, enhancing the channelization works in the Mapocho, while heartening urban life along the waterfront. And, as you saw before, the transformation of the Santa Lucia Hill first and of the San Cristobal later from rocky terrains into urban forests, becoming over time examples for the development of similar geographical units into emblems promoting the values of outdoor life within the city. By the end of the 19th century, these initiatives made visible the newly acquired economic power, nationalist aspirations, and social changes, with landscape designed to display a connection between utility and beauty, profit and pleasure, sustenance, and the representation of a green nation. An immediate consequence was the introduction of tree diversity, to the point that today we have more than 90% of tree species in the city that are exotic to the country. However, in the nascent 20th century scenario, with standardized housing and new functional order thanks to improved traffic circulation, landscapes not only define Santiago's urban character through botanical practices, they also forge visible boundaries for specific neighborhoods, aligning to this day with the city's arboreal and socio-spatial segregation. And this takes me to the second step of my goal, which is to unearth and describe the significant efforts involved in relocating, domesticating, breeding, and propagating trees, and the political decision-making guiding this process, and of course shaping the transformation of Santiago through the lens of landscape. Because, and spoiler alert here, despite of what this aerial photograph shows us, landscape operations were not developed here as a well-planned, large-scale project, but rather emerged as a reaction to specific circumstances that in a way also reflects the country's and the city's geographical isolation and cultural delay. Just consider that along the same terms that Chile evolved as an isolated backwater, as an almost invisible strip that expands for about 3,000 miles with an average of only 109 miles wide between the snow-capped Andes Mountains and the Pacific Ocean, its capital city, Santiago, which you can see here in black in the 1830s and in gray the area that covers today. The city sits in a relatively flat basin, a geographical depression that gradually slopes from the Andes in the east to another lower coastal mountain range to the west, the Cordillera de la Costa, which separates the Central Valley where the city stands from the Pacific Ocean. Consequently, just as the country was an interlude to European scientific, economic, and political colonial expansion expeditions until well into the 18th century, Santiago was no more than a hiccup in bioprospecting journeys to advance plant classification or to procure valuable foreign botanicals for acclimatization and collection, a scenario that delayed endeavors to experiment with the movement and introduction of plant species. With a population of about 97,000 in an area of 300 acres, by 1835, Santiago retained a colonial identity, even after the country's final declaration of independence in 1818. Although autonomy from Spain altered the political process and redefined the foreign relations, the social and economic conditions caused by colonization had remained essentially unchanged. This panorama was modified by mid-19th century, when a diverse group of city dwellers understood that in order to achieve an economic and cultural independence from Spain, it was not enough to construct new buildings, to represent republican institutions, or to improve roads and build railways to organize trade, facilitate production, and develop a regional network of settlements. And although in some sections of the city, alamedas were already offering new public ways, they also caused a landscape uniformity defined exclusively by poplars and ambiguously planted in linear rows a la rural way. Alamedas also demonstrated the discrepancy between appearance and purpose in landscape practices. The same shallow roots that were supposed to control the Mapocho River broke through road surfaces, challenging their functional suitability for roadside planting. It became urgent then to expand the city's botanical palette to support not only the landscape impulse led by the authorities, but also to demonstrate the new role of Chile's capital city as the national center for political and economic power. Thus, although thought of as a necessity, the process of experimentation and transference of foreign botanical practices and planting plants in Santiago would be the consequence of wealth. The key to this story is the role taken by a group of wealthy landowners involved in mining activities and by scientists, bureaucrats, and officials, some well-traveled and worldly, others in positions of significant influence in the country's development. Tied by land ownership and family connections, these citizens dominated and influenced Chilean society when they and their children intermarried, forming an incestuous political and economic elite that began demanding technical and cultural developments for their own states and for the city itself. In 1838, they created the National Society of Agriculture and Beneficence, to introduce updated agricultural practices, to improve public welfare in Chile, and to establish a secure network to transport, relocate, and test seeds and live specimens. With their official and societal liaisons, the society embraced the notion that Chile would only reach further development with the influence and support of Santiago's crème de la crème. And do not be afraid about the names you see splattered in these slides. I promise I won't get into details. I just want to make sure that you can appreciate the lattice involved in what I've called, of course, a green connection that unfolded with the creation of Chile Society of Agriculture. This event indeed takes us to the heart of this presentation, where two of my central considerations come together: the creation of model landscapes founded in botanical experimentation and the impact such an endeavor had on the larger cityscape. And specifically, I'm talking about the role of the Quinta Normal de Agricultura, the site the society devised as both a seed and plant exchange hub between the country and international centers, and as a prototype depicting how garden patterns can overcome environmental conditions. The Quinta was outlined first in the society's statutes that also established as one of the rights of the members, and I quote here, to attend courses of agriculture and practical works in a quinta, in the capital surroundings, to be established by the society when circumstances or budget allow it. Thus, since its creation, the society was intent on forging a center to demonstrate, study, and, in a way, enjoy the satisfaction derived from the successful propagation of plants and seeds brought from abroad. Now, as a civil organization driven by volunteers, the society's internal bureaucracy wore out the initial energies, and the project for the Quinta began with a 3-year period spent mainly in finding a suitable site, which you can see here in green to the left, together with the other 11 sites and options discussed at the time. So while deciding a definite location for its quinta, the society began to create exchange networks with some Chilean governors and with correspondents in nearby Argentina, Spain, Italy, Australia, the Russian Empire, Malta, but most of all from France and the United States, thus linking those far-flung territories with Chile. However, first manifestations of these efforts were tempered by logistics and practicalities of the transfer of seeds and live specimens across the oceans, by the absence of a proper place to develop species, and by a lack of systematization due to the inexistence of local expertise in storing plant materials and using them as key features in urban design. In this scenario, Chile's business representative in France, and also a society's founding member, suggested that the Quinta needed to emerge as a farm training center in which not only new agricultural but also horticultural practices would forge a relationship between plant collecting and political power, while transforming a semi-arid zone into a profitable, productive field and introducing a landscape narrative in a post-colonial city. In this scenario, it is not a coincidence that the Quinta's first design was put forward by a Frenchman, who was Claude Guay, a self-taught botanist and entomologist, who was conducting the first post-colonial expedition across the country, and was also the author of some of the images that you have seen before here. So, acting from his position as an active society board member from its very beginnings, he found the time to draw the first plan to transform a state in the site called Llano Portales, a 40-acre site located on the western outskirts of Santiago, on the south side of the road to Valparaíso, Chile's main harbor, and about 1.5 miles from the city's main square. Entitled An Acclimatization Garden for Santiago, Guay's proposal was presented to the Society on February 1841 and published the same month in its official bulletin under the format of a plan preceded by an 8-page description. Influenced by his leading role in helping Chile overcome its provincial condition, Guay strove to build a collective identity based on the development of useful plants within a new type of public space that could act as a model for the capital city. Accordingly, Guay defined his project as, quote here, a public garden, a pleasant stroll where vegetables are distributed with art and symmetry to awake among the farmers a taste for the ornament and the grandeur of the country that greatly contributes to the happiness of country living. In the months following the publication of the site's first design, Society's members prepare a budget and a list of exotic trees and plants to be requested from governmental officials acting in Europe and other countries throughout the Americas. As a result, by 1842, the Quinta was slowly turning into a curious repository of trees, shrubs, and plants, both native and exotic, and a beautiful and picturesque plantation managed and supported by the government, which formalized the formation, cultivation, and conservation of the site on December 1842 when passing the decree for its administration. In this scenario, the society also asked for someone with knowledge and capabilities to be designated in order to oversee the works on the center, a provision responding to the probability that Ge would be unable to fulfill his assignment due to his continuous travels along the country. And indeed, when works to develop the site began, Ge traveled to France to prepare the publication of his survey of Chile, thus abandoning the implementation of his plan for the Quinta as predicted. And after 6 years of disorganized management, in which neither Ge's approved plan was followed nor a new cohesive one proposed, the Society published the article An Agricultural Botanical Dissertation, presented to the Chilean Society of Agriculture and Beneficence, dated on May 17, 1848, and signed by Milanese agronomist Luigi Sada Di Carlo. Sada, who arrived to Chile in 1848 and was eager to secure a professional appointment, introduced himself to the society as an engineer and agronomist whose 38-page proposal was drafted as a critique of a project lacking in innovation, his words. To him, previous projects for the site were organized without using the notion of art science, agronomy, botany, which would be fundamental to shape the Quinta as a center for agricultural and horticultural research and experimentation. As the Quinta's first director and hired manager, Sada's first action was to prepare a plan organizing the plants and seeds already received throughout informal suppliers and transporters. As such, his simple sequence of large-scale cultivated fields was conceived as a landscape of demonstrative cultivation plots that could, his word, awaken the pleasure for plantation and be used as models to design other dry lands where vegetation is currently scarce. By 1850, the government had become dissatisfied with the Quinta's initial development as a nursery. So together with expanding the area to one with about 80 acres, the government also requested that Sada make adjustments to his original proposal. Consequently, he first enhanced and promoted the site as a mixing of gardening and farming activities and as a combination of pleasure and profit. He also reinforced the incipient sensibility provided by Santiago's Alamedas when arranging the different demonstration fields in an eggshell pattern, interconnecting them throughout planted roads. In time, these individuals would grow large enough for people to walk easily beneath, while providing pleasurable shade from the summer sun. He labeled these walkable perimeters for the different sections as public promenades, and in fact, they were arranged as a system of boulevards, not only interconnecting sections within the site, but also demonstrating the largest scale potential of tree-lined avenues in city planning. And to support his idea, the government reinforced the public character of the Quinta by arranging a free bi-weekly visits on Thursdays and Sundays, and the construction and maintenance of a transit system in the form of carriage roads, horse trails, and footpaths. So, in a way, this was the official attempt to transform the Quinta into a field of experiences, a condition that Sada interpreted as a renewed opportunity to attempt the introduction of tree species for farming, timber, and ornamental purposes, thus allowing a broader range of citizens to understand, select, and/or dismiss them after proving their long-time performance. He also positioned the Quinta as a seed and plant exchange hub with interaction between Chile and international centers. During his tenure, he developed a plant trade with similar climate zones that you can see here in gray, specifically with regions of France, Germany, Italy, Argentina, and most notably with nurseries and scientific centers in New York and Washington, D.C. One of his most important correspondents for the period was Lieutenant James Melvis Gillis, leader of the US Naval Astronomical Expedition to the Southern Hemisphere, which was based on Santa Lucia Hill between 1849 and 1852. Although the program of work included mainly the development of astronomical and meteorological observations in the hill, Gillies also considered that the spare time of those assigned to the expedition might be spent collecting specimens and observations on natural history. By the end of 1849, they began an incipient seed exchange that by 1851 had become a regular transaction of specimens between botanist William D. Brackenridge, then in charge of the greenhouses containing the living plants of the US expedition, and Sada, with Gillies acting as, in his words, the medium of communication between them. As a result, and to cut the story short, Gillies, Brackenridge, and Sada exchanged not only letters, but also seeds and dried and living plants. Sada made up a collection of 133 living plants of 14 species and varieties indigenous to Chile, and in return, he asked for particular species of North American trees. In February 1851, Brackenridge reported that he had collected in public grounds and forests near Washington some good trees and flowering shrub seeds, which I do fondly hope that most of them will reach you in a condition to germinate. As a probable result of this exchange, Sada reportedly planted an unknown number of American linden and American elms, 5,000 honey locusts, and 15,000 false acacias. A fair reading into Sada's efforts to collect any available specimen demonstrates the autonomous, self-sufficient, and experimental character of his commission to test the survival rate of varieties in an extreme Mediterranean climate. But this situation also exhibits the potential of his Quinta as a field trial to refurbish Santiago's public open facade, with Sada equally experimenting with the aesthetic qualities of plants and trees. For example, the large number of acacias suggests that Sada used their, generally speaking, open, grown, arcing form to offer the stroller an actual spatial rhythm, planting them close enough together to shape a canopy, offering tall and tunnel perspectives, contrasting with the horizontality of culture plots, as you can see on the left. Sada was successful with their implanting, domesticating, breeding, and propagation. Nowadays, they are familiar trees in Santiago, and with different levels of success, they are fairly tolerant to air pollution, poor drainage, compacted soils, and drought. Together with the aforementioned trees, the genera Sada most widely planted on the Quinta were exotic cypresses and willows, and endemic arrayanes and maitenes. The selection of endemic trees may have responded to Sada's predicting and getting again on the current debate regarding the use of exotic versus native species in design landscapes, hoping to increase species adaptability to future environmental change while promoting their development until becoming tolerant to the conditions that prevail on any given site. Sada also foresaw the potential of green boulevards in city planning, as I mentioned before, as disseminators of an easily reproducible urban condition. Indeed, during the following decade, arrayanes, maitenes, and elms were publicly promoted as the proper choices for tree-line avenues due to their elevated and rectilinear growth, a quality necessary to occupy the least amount of sidewalk surface possible, especially when you consider the narrow width of Chilean city walkways. By 1852, there were more than 163,000 trees accounted for in the Quinta, which is an astonishing 1,000% more than in 1849. And in his mission report, the same Gillies recognized that although the Quinta hadn't achieved the goal of introducing and instructing better agricultural methods, its erector, meaning Sada, had accomplished the foundation of a nursery of native and foreign useful and ornamental plants to be sold at equitable prices. And he also stated his hopes that the graduates will assist in making Chile one of the garden spots of the world. Sada's accomplishments were equally recorded in the government's annual accounts. The 1852 report, for example, stated that so far the Quinta had provided all plants of elms, lindens, and ashes to replace the poplars in the Alameda de las Delicias, and required trees to shape Santiago's newly created urban spaces or in process of renovation, such as the city's main square and the governmental palace square, Campo de Marte, today Parque O'Higgins, Plaza Yungay, and the city's general cemetery. A year later, Sada highlighted the Quinta's role as a successful acclimatization site, informing that during his tenure, seeds and trees were distributed in the cities of Valparaíso, Melipilla, and Lebu, and in the provinces of, in the south, Maule, Concepción, Valdivia, Chiloé, and the colony of Magallanes. In other words, by mid-19th century, the Quinta's trees had become the staple of Chile's post-colonial reform. They were used as evidence of the government's efforts to introduce civic health and public beauty within the urban context. Indeed, until the end of his tenure in 1853, Sada insisted that his Quinta not only showcased trees and crop, grasses and vines, for that matter, as a botanical and agricultural plant collection. Rather, it formed a larger landscape that would help to define ways to organize other urban structures. In time, Sada's Quinta became a major force in the production and circulation of new economic and botanical knowledge, enabling new forms of social interaction in a picturesque style testing ground with park qualities, characterized by the savoir-faire, arrangement of research and experimental plots that systematically naturalize, group, and produce local varieties of domesticated species and garden patterns. Due to the celebration of Santiago's international exhibition in 1875, the Quinta would achieve its maximum expansion and development as an ornamented farm, reflecting the nation's economic power. And you can see that area here in the dot line, and the dashes show the actual or current area. So, coming back to 1875, the construction of the astronomical observatory, the palace for the exhibition, which became the Museum of Natural History, and the botanical garden, which you saw in the previous photograph, would be followed by an agronomic teaching institute, a zoo, the city's first restaurant, and the first museum of fine arts, and even of a boating lake and a train service for touring the site. As such, the Quinta developed into somewhat of a hybrid, a cross between a pole of economic development and a site of learning, where botanical practices rendered as a utilitarian trade to further develop scientific knowledge. Following managers also maintained the site's condition as a recreational urban area, reflecting the social and cultural changes of Chilean society, by allowing the construction of sports clubs and identifying and even labeling a specific fragment of the Quinta as a public park. Just as the Quinta evolved into a newly organized social space, providing an exotic, agreeable, domestic canopy, by the 1870s, the whole city was transformed into a living laboratory to experiment with the artificial redistribution of plants in physical settings that formed a path for Santiago's systematic urban development through the lens of landscape. As a result, Sada's Quinta would materialize a green ideal for the nation. Agricultural fields and garden plots offered a jardin promenade for an established land-holding elite, while also demonstrating through trial and error valuable indicators of which plants could survive in Santiago's climate over time. And interestingly enough, while his Quinta was slowly promoting the transformation of other urban areas, Sada decided that to effectively influence the transformation of a city beyond the definition of green zones, it was necessary to work in one more consolidated than Santiago. So in 1870, the Peruvian government hired him to develop a plan for the 600-acre institute and normal hacienda for the teaching of agriculture and of the Republic of Peru. Probably knowing that a French-based design would be more compelling for the capital city of a former viceroyalty, Sada depicted the teaching of agricultural techniques and the display of horticultural possibilities in a site that was equally proposed as a visitor attraction. Sada introduced in Lima a composite or mixed garden, which you know better than me, in France in the second half of the 19th century articulated the relationship between the laws of arts and geometry with those of nature. Sada would contribute further to Lima's urban renewal because at the same time he obtained the commission for the shaping and construction of the agricultural center, he was hired to execute the first topographical plan of Peru's capital, which proposed the city's urban expansion to the coast of Callao by taking down the colonial walls that you can see in the bottom here in this map. And this is Sada's topographical plan and proposal, which main element was a 164 feet wide alameda with at least 4 rows of poplars, thus replacing the fortified borders and linking the Callao port to the capital, and also a number of boulevards branching downtown from the alameda, as well as new squares and suburbs. Sada would also propose a new palace for the National Exhibition of 1872 that, following the Quinta's example, would contribute in time to the organization of a park complex containing a botanical garden, a zoo, pavilions, fountains, and the like. All of these works would be key to changing Lima's outward appearance in tune with Haussmann's standards for Paris. Modernization would be introduced through channelization works along the Rimac River and through the construction of parks and public gardens, consequently driving real estate activity. More important to Chile, Sada's action in Lima undoubtedly provided the stylistic coordinates of the urban plan that would be developed in Santiago from 1872, led by a strong-minded governor, Intendente Benjamín Vicuña Maquena, who proposed 20 projects to transform Santiago, including the insertion of interconnected design landscapes, meaning squares, avenues, and parks, that provide the city with all the necessary hygienic improvements, given its healthiest and most beautiful climate on Earth, and lastly, allowing citizens to enjoy all amenities and beautifications that are moderately possible within our present means, as he stated in the publication promoting his initiatives. Among his most notable and lasting contributions were the transformation of the Santa Lucia Hill into a public park and the development of public works along the Mapocho River, providing pedestrians wide, shady, and definite riverside promenades. Vicuña Maquena also sponsored and supported the construction of the Cauciño Park, which nowadays we know as Parque O'Higgins, on the southern outskirts of the city, although it was not part of his original plan. In fact, the park was a private investment and part of a real estate operation to increase the value of its surrounding properties owned by mining mogul Luis Cauciño. In a strategically organized alliance between private interests and public agencies, in 1873, the year of Cauciño's death, the park was donated to the city, a situation that forced the creation of the position of Director of Gardens and Municipal Plantations, which also led to the arrival of the first hired landscape architects to the country, Alsatians Edouard de Beaumont and Guillaume Renner. And it was them, and not necessarily Vicuña Maquena, who spearheaded the impetus in landscaping that arose from the centennial celebrations in 1910. But, of course, that's another story, so thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, Romy. This was, I really appreciated how the research has grown and expanded to include a kind of global network of plant redistribution and people in so many different countries. I am curious as to, it seems like the image was always an agricultural image. And I am curious as to why, as to how that was identified and a kind of resistance to the importation of a kind of picturesque landscape, which would have been much more common in those other places where those plants came from. Is it because of the arid, the semi-arid sort of native condition, or was this taste for a kind of geometric, agricultural, highly cultivated botanical practice spoken about or articulated?
Yeah, I think to me, it's a combination of both, but also it's where the money comes from, in a way. Mm-hmm. So essentially, when I said the key to the story is the role played by these landowners, I think you have to take also into consideration our society. We are very conservative, very shy, very modest in public ways, but so all these people develop the picturesque side of the proposal in their own rural states. So that's why, for example, if you visit Santiago today, you'll find all these vineyards surrounding the city that had that picturesque taste. But those were private investments. So, and that's the other part of the story. People like René, the French guy that I showed in the very last slide, he was the one working for the municipality, but he was also the one designing all those landscapes. So he was like Dr. Jekyll and Hyde, right? He was working with scarce means, in the public realm, but he was taking advantage of all the money of these guys to just develop further his ideals. And that's something super relevant today because those vineyards, to follow that example, are owned by private companies. You can visit them. They have restored them. They have conserved the original taste. And if you go to the city, on the contrary, you see that there's nothing, almost nothing left, except for the hills that I would say remain as the prototypes of, or not prototypes, the models for that period in terms of the impetus of transformation. So, yeah.
You have a question?
I had one question, which maybe, I had one question, which maybe you talked about, which I didn't catch. Was there a concomitant discussion about what changing the landscape to suit these kind of new plants, about irrigation, a change about making these broad changes that would require this larger policy than just this garden, this of conduit, of all this sorts of, please don't take pictures for me. Which required bigger interventions for, hydrology, for changes in the hydrology of the region.
Yeah.
For this.
So that's a question about the irrigation operation.
Was there
yes, there was one. Yes. I'm sorry. I'm just presenting a fragment. If you go to the period that goes immediately before of the Quinta's creation, specifically in the early 1800s, you'll see that that was the main challenge, basically. Santiago has two rivers, the Mapocho, which you saw in the images, and also the Maipo River, which is in the southern section of the city. And the biggest project was to bring the water from the Maipo to the city, and they did so by building a channel called Canal San Carlos, which crosses the whole city in its eastern section. So without that, all the rest would be impossible. Also, in the case of the Quinta, Sada, I think, built about 20-something channels, irrigation channels, bringing water from the Mapocho to water the Quinta. So it's a very good question, because in every one of these projects, in order to keep this permanent green condition, you really need that. You have to tell that story too, because it's super connected. I mean, you cannot tell one without the other. But I would say that the major effort was developed in the first half of the 19th century. Then, of course, it was a continuous production of the same, but that was the focus, the time period focus, I mean.
Romy, first of all, that paper was so enviably lucid and informative, so thank you so much for that. And we'll discuss this later, but three comments I had very immediately. One was that first slide you showed was very touching to me, because with respect to what Anita was saying in terms of establishing a discourse for Chile, and your first slide was, I would call it florilegium, a collection of flowers, that you had to produce an archive and then produce a project for that archive. And it makes me think of how truly foundational your work is. Two other things very quickly were, well, I'll come to this. The first one, you used this word pièce de résistance, which I thought was fabulous, because it's in a normal meaning, you think of something as a masterpiece, but no, you're saying these trees have to, and yeah. I thought that was a very clever and informative use of the term, and it really makes us rethink the ornamental function of trees versus their robustness, and when they're varietals, when they're imports, and I thought that was a very strong term to deploy in this context. And thirdly, and quickly, and this is a much more complicated question, is I was very impressed by the juxtaposition between this global trade and exchange of seeds and cultivars versus, or plus, I'm not sure, what you called an inbred social network, which, the miners, and that to me is a very interesting story to tell. The social inbreeding versus the botanical kind of cosmopolitanism.
Yeah, which was also, thanks for the comments, for sure, and the question, because that was also produced by the same people. That network was not because there was a director of a botanical garden in Chile talking to a director of the Kew Gardens, for example, but it was because these people would travel and would say to the society's board when they were back, listen, I brought, 5 whatever tree for the Quinta, do we want them? And that was it. It looks, I've been able to trace all the shipments and the dates and the people involved, but basically it was the same people doing the same. So I think that part to me is fascinating. It requires, I've been writing about that, even identifying the sites where they were also keeping some of those seeds and trees for them. And if you remember, I showed the 11 possibilities for the Quinta. Those were sites of the same members who were offering those for sale, for sure, for the development of the site. So, the societal connection is super interesting, because they were also the ones ruling the country. That's another story too. So it's the same people at the very end. Yeah, so welcome to Latin America, I would say, essentially.
Same thing happened.
Well, you never know. Okay.
Okay,
Thank you so much for sticking with me.